He came to visit his son's grave, seeking peace. But what he found instead was a woman standing beside the same headstone, and the truth behind it will leave you speechless. The morning mist clung to the marble headstones like whispered secrets, and Henry Lockett had never felt more alone in his life. His Armani suit, worth more than most people's monthly salary, felt heavy against his shoulders as he knelt beside the small granite marker that bore his son's name. Timothy James Lockett, age 7, beloved son. Hi, my beautiful family. Let's start with a blessing. Dear Lord, I ask you to surround every person watching with peace, healing, and endless love. Amen. You are not just an audience. You are my family, the reason I push through on the hardest days. For those who are new here, welcome to the family. Please subscribe, say hello in the comments, and let's grow closer together. Each story I bring is my sacrifice and devotion. When you walk away early, it feels like my heart is left unheard. Please, stay with me through the journey until the very end. I love you always. Now, let us begin. The cemetery was supposed to be empty at this hour. Henry had specifically chosen 6 a.m. for his visits to avoid the prying eyes of reporters and the sympathetic glances of strangers who recognized his face from Forbes covers. Here, among the silent dead, he could finally shed the mask of the ruthless billionaire and become what he truly was, a broken father drowning in guilt. His fingers traced the carved letters of his son's name, the stone cold beneath his touch despite the warming October sun. 3 months. It had been 3 months since the accident, since his world had crumbled like ash in his hands. 3 months since he'd last heard Timothy's infectious laugh echo through their mansion's empty halls. "I'm sorry, buddy," Henry whispered, his voice cracking in a way that would have shocked his business rivals. "Daddy's so sorry he wasn't there when you needed him most." The sound of soft footsteps on gravel made him freeze. His head snapped up, expecting to see a groundskeeper or perhaps another early mourner. Instead, his eyes fell upon a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, her slight frame wrapped in a thin cardigan that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she clutched a single white rose in her trembling hands. But it wasn't her appearance that made Henry's breath catch in his throat. It was where she was heading. She walked directly to Timothy's grave. Henry watched in stunned silence as the stranger knelt beside his son's headstone, just as he had been doing moments before. She placed the rose gently against the marble, her lips moving in what appeared to be a silent prayer. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and her shoulders shook with the kind of grief that Henry recognized all too well, the grief of someone who had lost everything. "Who are you?" The words escaped his lips before he could stop them. The young woman's head jerked up, her wide brown eyes meeting his with a mixture of surprise and fear. She scrambled to her feet, nearly stumbling backward in her haste. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know anyone else would be here. I can leave." "No." Henry stood slowly, his mind racing with questions that demanded answers. "Don't leave. Please." He took a careful step toward her, noting how she instinctively stepped back. "I'm Henry Lockett. Timothy was my son." The color drained from her face completely. You're his father?" Something in her tone made his chest tighten. This wasn't the usual reaction he received when people learned his identity. There was no awe, no calculating gleam in her eyes that he'd grown accustomed to seeing. Instead, there was something else entirely, guilt perhaps, or fear. "Yes," he said quietly. And you are. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, her gaze darting between his face and the path that led back to the cemetery's entrance. For a moment, Henry thought she might actually run. But then her shoulders sagged in defeat, and she whispered a name that would change everything he thought he knew about his son's death. My name is Sophia Rivera, and Mr. Lockett. She took a shuddering breath, her next words barely audible. I'm the reason your son is dead. The world seemed to tilt beneath Henry's feet. The morning air suddenly felt too thin, and the sound of his own heartbeat thundered in his ears. This fragile young woman, who looked like she could barely afford her next meal, was claiming responsibility for the tragedy that had destroyed his life. What did you just say? His voice came out as a harsh whisper. Sophia's tears fell faster now, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold her breaking heart together. The accident, it was my fault. I've been coming here every day since it happened, trying to find the courage to tell you the truth. But seeing you here now, she looked up at him with eyes full of anguish. I know you must hate me, but you deserve to know what really happened that night. Henry stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. Every instinct told him to demand answers immediately, to unleash the fury that had been building inside him for months. But something about the raw pain in her voice, the way she looked at Timothy's grave as if her own heart was buried there too, gave him pause. What connection could this girl possibly have to my son? And why does she look at his grave like she's mourning him too? Henry's world had narrowed to this single moment. Standing in a cemetery at dawn, facing a woman who claimed responsibility for his son's death. The rational part of his mind, the part that had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from nothing, screamed at him to demand immediate answers. But something deeper, more primal, held him back. Sophia Rivera stood before him like a broken bird, her thin shoulders trembling beneath her worn cardigan. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept properly in months. Her clothes, while clean, were clearly second-hand, a stark contrast to the designer grief counselors and lawyers who had surrounded him since Timothy's death. Please, Sophia whispered, her voice catching. Let me explain. You have every right to hate me, but Timothy, he deserves for you to know the truth about what kind of boy he was. The way she said his son's name, with such tenderness, such familiarity, made Henry's chest tighten. You knew my son? Sophia's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where Henry noticed she wore a small silver locket. He saved my life, Mr. Lockett. In more ways than one. Henry felt his knees weaken. He'd spent 3 months believing he knew everything about Timothy's final day. The police report was clear. His son had been struck by a vehicle while crossing Fifth Avenue after school. The driver had fled the scene. Case closed, justice denied, life destroyed. But this woman was suggesting there was more to the story. I need to sit down, Henry said, his voice hoarse. He gestured toward a nearby bench, and Sophia nodded, following him with hesitant steps. As they settled onto the cold stone bench, Henry studied her profile. She couldn't have been more than 25, with delicate features that spoke of mixed heritage, perhaps Latina and something else. Her hands were small but calloused, the hands of someone who worked with them. A small scar ran along her left wrist, barely visible beneath her cardigan sleeve. Tell me, Henry said quietly. Tell me how you knew my son. Sophia closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they shimmered with unshed tears. I was homeless, Mr. Lockett. Had been for 3 months after I aged out of foster care. I was sleeping in Riverside Park, trying to stay invisible, trying to survive. She paused, her fingers absently touching the locket at her throat. Timothy found me there one afternoon about 2 weeks before the accident. Henry's breath caught. Timothy had been walking home from his private school along that route, but Henry had no idea his son had been making detours through the park. He was just 7 years old, but he stopped when he saw me crying. Can you imagine? This little boy in his pristine school uniform, with his perfect backpack and his. Sophia's voice broke slightly, his kind eyes just like yours. He asked me if I was okay. The image hit Henry like a physical blow. He could see it so clearly. Timothy with his unruly dark hair and those deep brown eyes that seemed too wise for his age, approaching a stranger in need. It was exactly something his compassionate son would do. What did you tell him? Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The truth. That I was hungry and scared and had nowhere to go. And do you know what your 7-year-old son did? Sophia turned to face him fully, and Henry saw his own grief reflected in her eyes. He gave me his lunch, his whole lunch, and then he sat with me for an hour, telling me stories about his school, his dreams of becoming a veterinarian, and, she smiled through her tears, about his daddy who built buildings that touched the sky. Henry's vision blurred. Timothy had always been proud of his father's work, despite Henry's frequent absences. The boy would spend hours at construction sites when Henry occasionally brought him along, asking endless questions about engineering and architecture. He came back the next day, Sophia continued, her voice growing stronger. And the day after that, always with food, sometimes with books he thought I might like. He told me about his mother, how she died when he was 4, and how it was just you and him now. He worried about you, Mr. Lockett. Said you worked too much and looked sad when you thought he wasn't watching. The words hit Henry like shards of glass. Timothy had been right. Henry had thrown himself into work after his wife Elena's death, using 18-hour days as armor against his grief. He'd told himself he was providing for Timothy's future, but the truth was he'd been running from the pain of loss. Timothy made me promise I'd try to get help, Sophia said. He said his daddy always told him that every problem had a solution if you were brave enough to look for it. So I started going to the community center, trying to get back on my feet. I even got a job interview, my first real chance in months. Sophia's voice began to shake, and Henry felt dread pooling in his stomach. The interview was on October 15th, downtown. I was so nervous, so desperate not to mess it up. Timothy had given me money. I don't know where a 7-year-old got $20, but he insisted I take it for bus fare. October 15th, the day Timothy died. But the buses were running late because of construction, Sophia continued, her words coming faster now, as if she needed to get them out before she lost her courage. I was going to be late for the interview, my one chance. So I made a choice that I'll regret for the rest of my life. Henry's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white against his dark slacks. I took a cab, but I didn't have enough money, so when we got caught in traffic, Sophia's voice broke completely. I asked the driver to let me out early. I was going to run the last few blocks. I was so focused on not being late, so desperate to make Timothy proud by getting that job, that I didn't look when I stepped into the street. The pieces began falling into place in Henry's mind, each one more devastating than the last. The car that hit Timothy, Henry said slowly, it was swerving to avoid you. Sophia nodded, tears streaming down her face. He saw what was going to happen before I did. This little boy, your little boy, he ran into the street and pushed me out of the way. The car that would have killed me. She covered her face with her hands. It killed him instead. Henry felt the world spinning around him. For 3 months, he'd imagined Timothy's death as a senseless tragedy, a random accident that meant nothing. But this was different. Timothy hadn't died randomly. He'd died being exactly who Henry had raised him to be. Brave, selfless, and kind. The driver panicked and fled, Sophia whispered. And I held your son in my arms as he died. His last words were about you, Mr. Lockhart. He asked me to tell you that he loved you and that he wasn't scared because he knew you'd taught him to be brave. Henry doubled over, as if he'd been physically struck, a sound escaping his throat that was half sob, half roar. 3 months of rage and grief and guilt crashed over him like a tsunami, but underneath it all was something else. A terrible, beautiful understanding of who his son had truly been. But why has she been carrying this alone? And what else isn't she telling me about that day? The silence between them stretched like a taut wire, filled only by the distant sound of morning traffic and Sophia's quiet sobs. Henry sat motionless, his mind reeling from revelations that had shattered everything he thought he knew about his son's final moments. But as the initial shock began to fade, questions started forming. Questions that demanded answers. Why didn't you come forward? Henry's voice was rough, barely controlled. Why didn't you tell the police what really happened? Sophia flinched as if he'd struck her. I tried. I went to the station that same night, covered in his blood, trying to explain. But she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. They took one look at me, homeless, no permanent address, no family, and decided I was either lying or mentally unstable. The detective said I was probably just seeking attention, trying to insert myself into a high-profile case. Henry's jaw clenched. He knew the type of detective she meant, the ones who saw wealth and poverty as 2 different species, incapable of meaningful intersection. They told me to go home and grieve properly, Sophia continued, her voice bitter. Home. To a park bench. She looked up at him with eyes full of anguish. I kept trying, Mr. Lockhart. I called the tip line 17 times. I wrote letters. I even tried to reach you directly, but your security team. She trailed off, the implication clear. Henry remembered the flood of letters and calls after Timothy's death. Fortune hunters, conspiracy theorists, well-meaning but misguided condolences. His assistant had been instructed to filter them all. How many genuine attempts to reach him had been lost in that deluge? Show me, he said suddenly. What? Show me proof. Show me that you knew Timothy like you say you did. Sophia's hand moved to the locket at her throat, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph, Timothy's school picture from this year, the one where he was missing his front tooth and grinning at the camera with pure joy. But it was what was written on the back that made Henry's breath catch. In Timothy's careful 7-year-old handwriting, for Sophia, my friend, you're braver than you think. Love, Timmy. Henry's hands shook as he held the locket. Timothy had hated being called Timmy by anyone except family. The fact that he'd allowed Sophia to use the nickname, that he'd given her his school picture. There's more, Sophia whispered. She reached into her worn purse and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with Timothy's drawings and stories. Pictures of buildings that looked suspiciously like Henry's architectural projects, stories about a brave princess who helped people, and on the last page, a drawing of two stick figures under a rainbow with the words, "Daddy and me when we're both happy again." Henry stared at the drawing, his vision blurring. Timothy had been worried about his father's happiness, had been planning for a future where they could heal together from Elena's loss. A future that would never come. "He talked about you constantly," Sophia said softly. "He was so proud of you, but he was worried too. He said you forgot to eat sometimes, that you worked so late he'd fallen asleep before you came home. He wanted to help you, the way he was trying to help me." The words hit Henry like physical blows. While he'd been drowning in his own grief and work, Timothy had been out in the world, being the kind of man Henry had hoped to raise him to become. And now, because of his father's emotional absence, Timothy was gone. "I should have been there," Henry said, his voice cracking. "If I hadn't been working late, if I'd picked him up from school like I was supposed to." "No." Sophia's voice was firm, startling them both. "Don't you dare blame yourself for Timothy's choice. He saw someone in danger, and he acted. That's who he was, Mr. Lockett. That's the son you raised." She clutched the notebook to her chest. "He died being a hero. He died saving someone he cared about." Henry looked at this young woman, this stranger who had known his son better in 2 weeks than he'd realized he did in 7 years. Sophia's pain was real, her grief genuine, but there was something else in her eyes now. Something that looked like, "You loved him," Henry said suddenly, the realization hitting him like lightning. "Not romantically, but you loved my son." Sophia's composure finally cracked completely. "He was the first person in 3 years to see me as human," she sobbed. "The first person to believe I was worth saving. When everyone else looked at me like I was garbage, like I was invisible, Timothy saw me. Really saw me." She looked up at Henry with desperate eyes. "He was just 7 years old, but he taught me that I mattered, that I deserved better, that I could fight for a future." Henry felt something shifting inside his chest, a crack in the wall of rage and grief he'd built around his heart. This woman hadn't just taken his son from him. In a twisted way, she'd given Timothy the chance to be everything Henry had hoped he would become. But as he studied Sophia's face, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The way she kept glancing toward the cemetery entrance. The nervous energy that seemed to vibrate beneath her grief. The way she clutched her purse like it contained something precious or dangerous. "Sophia," he said slowly, "what aren't you telling me?" Her face went white. "What do you mean?" "You've been coming here every day for 3 months. You've been carrying this guilt, this story, this." He gestured to the notebook and locket. "But there's something else. Something you're afraid to tell me." Sophia's breathing became rapid and shallow. She started to stand, but Henry caught her wrist gently. "Please," he said. "Whatever it is, I need to know. Timothy deserves for me to know everything." Sophia looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up at his face. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "The driver, Mr. Lockett. The one who hit Timothy and ran." Henry's grip tightened involuntarily. "What about him?" "I saw his face. I got his license plate number. I know exactly who killed your son." The world seemed to stop. Henry had spent 3 months hoping against hope that the police would find Timothy's killer, that justice would somehow ease his pain. The case had gone cold within weeks, no witnesses, no leads, no hope. "Why didn't you tell the police?" Sophia's laugh was bitter and broken. "I tried, but no one would listen to a homeless girl with no credibility. And then," she pulled her wrist free and stepped back. "I found out who he was, who his family is. And I realized that even if the police believed me, even if I could prove it, justice was never going to happen. Who? Henry's voice was deadly quiet. Who killed my son? Sophia met his eyes, and in them, Henry saw not just grief and guilt, but fury. Pure, burning rage that matched his own. District Attorney Michael Brennan's son. James Brennan, 22 years old, driving Daddy's car, probably high or drunk or both. Her voice grew stronger with each word. The same DA who announced on the news that he would personally ensure Timothy's killer was brought to justice. He's been covering for his own son for 3 months. Henry felt something dark and violent unfurl in his chest. The man who had stood beside him at press conferences, who had promised justice for Timothy, who had used his son's death as a platform for his tough-on-crime rhetoric. That man had been protecting the killer all along. I have proof, Sophia continued, her voice steady now despite her tears. Photos, the license plate, witness statements from other homeless people that the police ignored. Everything we need to destroy James Brennan and his father both. She pulled a manila envelope from her purse with shaking hands. But I also know that people like me don't take down people like them. Not alone. She held out the envelope to Henry. That's why I've been waiting for you, Mr. Lockhart. Hoping you'd come here. Hoping I'd find the courage to tell you the truth. Henry stared at the envelope as if it were a weapon, which, in many ways, it was. Timothy died because he tried to save me, Sophia said, her voice growing fierce. The least I can do is help you get justice for him. But I need to know, are you ready to fight for your son? Really fight? Because taking down the DA is going to be war. Henry took the envelope, feeling its weight in his hands. Inside was everything he needed to destroy the men who had killed his son and covered it up. Justice for Timothy. Revenge for the months of lies and false hope. But as he looked at Sophia, brave, broken, beautiful Sophia who had loved his son enough to risk everything for him, Henry realized something else was happening. Something he hadn't felt since Elena died. He wasn't alone anymore. But can he trust this mysterious woman who seems to have all the answers? And what will happen when the most powerful man in the city realizes his secret is no longer safe? 3 days after their meeting in Sophia's apartment, Henry's world exploded. He was sitting in his corner office on the 42nd floor of Lockhart Tower, reviewing the evidence Sophia had compiled, when his assistant burst through the door without knocking, something Margaret had never done in 15 years of employment. "Mr. Lockhart," she said, her face pale with panic. "There are FBI agents in the lobby. They're asking for you." Henry's blood turned to ice. He quickly closed the folder containing Sophia's evidence and slipped it into his desk drawer. "What do they want?" "They wouldn't say, sir. But there are reporters with them." Henry moved to his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the street below. News vans lined the sidewalk, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like accusing fingers. Whatever was happening, it was big enough to draw media attention. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Don't trust anyone. They know we're working together. Meet me at the place where Timothy liked to feed the ducks. 1 hour. Come alone. S**. Henry's chest tightened. How had their investigation been discovered so quickly? And how much danger was Sophia in? 20 minutes later, Henry sat across from FBI agent Patricia Mills in his conference room, his lawyer beside him as a precautionary measure. Agent Mills was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and the kind of controlled intensity that made Henry's business instincts scream danger. Mr. Lockhart, Agent Mills began, we understand you've been in contact with Sophia Rivera regarding your son's death. Henry kept his expression neutral, years of high-stakes negotiations serving him well. I'm not sure what you mean. We have surveillance footage of you and Ms. Rivera together at Riverside Cemetery 3 days ago. We also have records of your vehicle at her residential facility in Queens. Agent Mills leaned forward. Mr. Lockhart, Sophia Rivera is a person of interest in an ongoing federal investigation. Henry's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. What kind of investigation? Ms. Rivera has been making serious allegations against District Attorney Michael Brennan and his son. Allegations that could be considered defamatory if they're false. Agent Mills studied Henry's face carefully. She's also been gathering what she claims is evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Evidence that could be fabricated. Henry's lawyer, David Chun, leaned forward. Are you suggesting my client has done something illegal by speaking with this woman? I'm suggesting, Agent Mills said coolly, that Mr. Lockhart may be the victim of an elaborate con game. Sophia Rivera has a history of making false claims against wealthy individuals. The words hit Henry like a physical blow. What are you talking about? Agent Mills opened a file and spread several documents across the table. Sophia Rivera, also known as Sophia Martinez, also known as Sarah Valdez. She's used multiple identities over the past 5 years. She's been investigated for fraud in 3 different states. Henry stared at the documents, his vision swimming. Arrest records, fraud allegations, restraining orders filed by previous marks. According to the FBI file, Sophia was a professional con artist who specialized in targeting wealthy men who had recently lost family members. No, Henry said, his voice hoarse. This is wrong. She knew Timothy. She had his drawings, his photograph, all of which could have been obtained from his school, from news reports about his death, from any number of public sources. Agent Mills's voice was almost gentle. Mr. Lockhart, I know this is difficult to hear. Grief makes us vulnerable to people who would exploit our pain. Henry's mind raced, trying to reconcile the Sophia he'd met, broken, grieving, genuine, with the career criminal described in these files. But even as he struggled to deny it, pieces began clicking into place. Her detailed knowledge of Timothy's death. Her convenient appearance at the cemetery exactly when Henry was most vulnerable. The evidence that seemed almost too perfect, too complete. The homeless witnesses she claims to have, Agent Mills continued. We've interviewed them. 2 admitted she paid them to corroborate her story. The 3rd has a severe mental illness and is considered an unreliable witness. Henry felt the walls of the conference room closing in on him. The photographs, photoshopped. We had our tech team analyze them. The image of James Brennan behind the wheel has been digitally manipulated. The folder Sophia had given him suddenly felt like poison in his desk drawer. Everything she'd shown him, everything she'd made him believe, had been an elaborate lie designed to exploit his grief and his guilt over Timothy's death. What does she want from me? Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Money, most likely. She's probably building toward asking for funds to help with her investigation, or her legal fees. It's a common pattern with this type of fraud. Agent Mills closed the file. Mr. Lockhart, I need to ask, has Ms. Rivera requested any financial assistance from you? Henry shook his head numbly. Sophia hadn't asked him for money. If anything, she'd seemed embarrassed by their financial differences, uncomfortable in his car. hesitant to let him into her world. But then he remembered her text, her insistence that they meet alone. Maybe this was it. Maybe she was finally ready to make her move. "We'd like you to help us," Agent Mills said. "We're a wire to your meeting with her. Let her incriminate herself. Help us put an end to this before she targets another grieving parent." Henry stared at the FBI agent, his mind spinning. Everything he'd believed about Timothy's death, about Sophia's connection to his son, about the possibility of justice, all of it crumbling around him like a house of cards. But something nagged at him, something that didn't fit. "If she's such a dangerous con artist," Henry said slowly, "why isn't she in prison? Why are these just investigations and allegations?" Agent Mills exchanged a glance with her partner. The victims rarely press charges. They're too embarrassed, too traumatized by the realization that they've been manipulated. But this time is different. This time, she's made allegations against a public official. We can't let that slide. Henry felt a chill run down his spine. The FBI was here not just to protect him from Sophia, but to protect District Attorney Brennan from Sophia's accusations. Which meant either Sophia was indeed a dangerous con artist, or she was telling the truth and had managed to rattle some very powerful cages. "I need time to think," Henry said. "Mr. Lockett," Agent Mills said urgently, "every moment you delay gives her more opportunity to manipulate you. She's probably already planning her next move." Henry stood up, his lawyer rising with him. "I said I need time to think. If you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend." An hour later, Henry stood beside the small pond in Central Park where Timothy used to feed the ducks during their weekend outings. The autumn air was crisp, leaves dancing on the water's surface like tiny boats. He'd come here often in the weeks after Timothy's death, trying to feel close to his son's memory. Now he wondered if even this sacred place had been violated by Sophia's manipulation. She appeared from behind a cluster of trees, moving carefully and looking over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. When she saw Henry, relief flooded her face. "Thank God you came," she said, rushing toward him. "Henry, we're in trouble. Someone broke into my apartment last night. They took some of the evidence, but not all of it. I think they're trying to." "Stop," Henry said, his voice cold and flat. Sophia froze, confusion replacing relief in her eyes. "What's wrong?" "I know what you are," Henry said. "I know about your other names, your other marks. I know about the fraud investigations." Sophia's face went white. For a moment, she looked exactly like the cornered con artist the FBI had described. But then her expression crumpled, and she sank onto a nearby bench as if her legs could no longer support her. "They got to you," she whispered. "I should have known they would move fast. They showed me your file, Sophia. Or should I call you Sarah? Or Martinez?" Henry's voice was bitter with betrayal. Multiple identities, fraud allegations, a pattern of targeting wealthy, grieving men. Sophia looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it to me." Henry crossed his arms, his business mask firmly in place. "Explain how a career con artist just happened to know intimate details about my dead son." Sophia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, taking a shuddering breath. "Because those aren't fraud cases, Henry. They're witness protection identities." Henry felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "What? I'm not a con artist. I'm a federal witness. Have been for 3 years." Sophia's voice grew stronger, more urgent. "The fraud allegations, the false identities, they're all part of my cover. I've been testifying against organized crime families, corrupt politicians, human trafficking rings. Every time I surface with a new identity, they find me, and the FBI has to move me again." Henry stared at her, his mind struggling to process this new information. "You're telling me you're in witness protection?" "Was in witness protection," Sophia corrected. "I broke protocol when I decided to investigate Timothy's death. The FBI warned me to stay away, told me it was too dangerous to surface again so soon after my last relocation. But I couldn't let his death go unavenged." Henry felt his carefully constructed reality cracking again. "If that's true, if you're really a federal witness, then why would the FBI be trying to discredit you to me?" Sophia's smile was grim and knowing. "Because 3 of the cases I testified in involved Michael Brennan's office. I have evidence that he's been taking bribes, covering up crimes, working with the same organized crime families I helped put away." She looked up at Henry with desperate intensity. "Don't you see? Timothy's death isn't just about his son's hit and run. It's about exposing a corruption network that goes all the way to the top of this city's power structure." Henry's head spun. If Sophia was telling the truth, then the FBI agents who had visited him weren't there to protect him from a con artist. They were there to protect a corrupt system from exposure. "How do I know you're not lying now?" Henry asked, but even as he said it, he realized he wanted to believe her. The alternative, that Timothy's death was meaningless, that there would be no justice, that he'd been manipulated by a skilled con artist, was too devastating to accept. Sophia reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device. "Because I'm about to prove it to you. But first, I need you to know that everything I told you about Timothy was true. Every word, every story, every moment we shared." She stood up, moving closer to him. "And I need you to know that somewhere along the way, this stopped being just about justice for your son." "What do you mean?" Sophia's hand trembled as she reached up to touch his face. "I mean, I'm falling in love with you, Henry Lockett. And that terrifies me more than any organized crime family ever could." Before Henry could respond, Sophia pressed the button on the device in her hand. Suddenly, voices filled the air around them. A recording of the FBI agent's conversation from Henry's office, but continuing after he'd left the room. "Do you think he bought it?" Agent Mills's voice was clear and cold. "He's rattled enough. Brennan will be pleased." "Good. The Rivera woman is getting too close to the truth. If we can't discredit her through Lockett, we may have to consider more permanent solutions." "Understood. What about the real evidence she has?" "We'll handle it. One way or another, this investigation ends now." Henry stared at Sophia in shock as the recording continued, revealing the depth of the corruption they were facing. She hadn't been lying. She wasn't a con artist. She was exactly who she'd claimed to be, a woman who had loved his son, who was risking everything to get him justice. And she was in mortal danger because of it. "Sophia," Henry whispered, pulling her into his arms as the full weight of her revelation crashed over him. "I'm so sorry. I should have trusted you." "We don't have time for apologies," Sophia said, her voice muffled against his chest. "They're going to come for both of us now. We have maybe 6 hours before they realize I have that recording." Henry pulled back to look at her face, seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a con artist or a victim, but as a warrior, a woman who had survived witness protection, who had risked everything for Timothy's memory, who was brave enough to love him despite the danger it brought. "Then we'd better make those 6 hours count," Henry said, his voice grim with determination. It's time to take down the Brennans, and everyone protecting them. As they stood together in the place where Timothy used to feed the ducks, Henry realized that his son had given him more than just the truth about his death. Timothy had given him Sophia, a partner, an ally, and maybe, if they survived what was coming, the love he'd thought he'd lost forever. But neither of them realized that their enemies had been listening to every word, and that the deadliest phase of their fight was just beginning. The black SUV appeared in Henry's rearview mirror as they drove away from Central Park, its tinted windows reflecting the late afternoon sun like dead eyes. Sophia noticed it at the same time, her hand instinctively reaching for the door handle. "Don't," Henry said quietly, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "If we run now, we'll look guilty." "We are guilty," Sophia replied, her voice tight with fear. "Guilty of knowing the truth." Henry's phone buzzed with an incoming call. DA Michael Brennan's name flashed on the screen, and Sophia's breath caught. Henry answered, putting it on speaker. "Henry." Brennan's voice was warm and familiar, the same tone he'd used at Timothy's funeral when he'd promised justice. "I hear you've been having some interesting conversations lately." "I don't know what you mean, Michael," Henry replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Come now, we're old friends. Golf partners. I was at your wedding, remember?" Brennan's tone shifted slightly, gaining an edge. "That's why I'm giving you this courtesy call. Walk away from Sophia Rivera, Henry. She's not who you think she is." Sophia shook her head frantically, pointing to the recording device still clutched in her hand. Henry understood. They needed to keep Brennan talking. "Why don't you tell me who you think she is?" Henry said. There was a pause, and Henry could almost hear Brennan's calculating mind at work. "She's a dangerous woman with a vendetta against my family. A mentally unstable individual who's been stalking my son, making wild accusations about Timothy's death." "What kind of accusations?" "The kind that could destroy innocent lives, Henry. The kind that prey on a grieving father's desperate need for answers." Brennan's voice grew softer, more manipulative. "I know you want justice for Timothy. We all do. But Sophia Rivera isn't the answer. She's the problem." Sophia was frantically writing on a piece of paper, showing it to Henry. "Ask him about the other victims." "Michael," Henry said carefully, "have there been other cases like Timothy's? Other hit and runs involving your son?" The silence stretched so long that Henry thought the call had dropped. When Brennan finally spoke, his voice was completely different. Cold, threatening, all pretense of friendship abandoned. "You've made a very serious mistake, Henry. Both of you." The line went dead. Sophia stared at the phone, her face pale. "He just confessed. He didn't deny it. He threatened us instead." "We need to get somewhere safe," Henry said, checking his mirrors again. The black SUV was still following, joined now by a second vehicle. "Somewhere public with witnesses." "No," Sophia said, her voice suddenly firm. "We need to disappear. Right now. They're not going to arrest us, Henry. They're going to make us disappear." Henry felt ice water flood his veins. "What are you talking about?" "I've seen this before. When witnesses get too close to the truth, when they have evidence that could bring down powerful people." Sophia's voice broke slightly. "They don't take chances. They eliminate the problem permanently." As if to confirm her fears, Henry's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Asterisk, your son learned what happens to people who get in our way. Don't make the same mistake. Asterisk." Henry's vision went red. They were using Timothy's death as a threat. turning his murdered child into a weapon against him. The fury that rose in his chest was so intense it nearly made him swerve off the road. "Henry, listen to me," Sophia said urgently. "I have a safe house. Somewhere the FBI doesn't know about. We can go there, regroup, figure out our next move. Why should I trust you?" The words escaped before Henry could stop them, and he immediately regretted them when he saw the hurt flash across Sophia's face. "Because," she said quietly, "I've already lost everything that mattered to me once. I won't let them take you too." Something in her tone made Henry look at her more closely. "What do you mean?" Sophia stared out the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "I told you I've been in witness protection for 3 years. I told you I testified against organized crime families. What I didn't tell you is why." Henry waited, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything between them. "I was married," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name was David. He was a detective, working undercover to investigate police corruption. When he got too close to the truth, they killed him. Made it look like a drug deal gone wrong." Henry's chest tightened. "Sophia, I saw it happen," she continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was supposed to meet him that night. I arrived early and watched from across the street as his partner, Henry, put a bullet in his head." The pieces clicked into place in Henry's mind. Sophia hadn't just been a witness to corruption. She'd been a victim of it. She'd lost the person she loved most to the same kind of cover-up that was protecting Timothy's killer. "That's why you broke protocol," Henry said, understanding flooding through him. "That's why you risked everything to investigate Timothy's death. Because you know what it's like to lose someone and watch their killers walk free." Sophia nodded, wiping her eyes. "When I heard about Timothy's case, when I realized the same pattern was happening again, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. I couldn't let another family go through what I went through." Henry reached across the car and took her hand. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for doubting you. We can apologize to each other later," Sophia said, squeezing his fingers. "Right now, we need to survive." They drove in tense silence for 20 minutes, taking a winding route through Queens before pulling into the parking garage of a nondescript apartment building. Sophia led him to a 4th-floor unit, producing keys from a hidden pocket in her jacket. The apartment was sparse but functional, a safe house indeed, with reinforced doors, security cameras, and enough supplies to last for weeks. Sophia immediately went to a wall-mounted panel and began checking the security system. "All clear," she said, but her voice was strained. "For now." Henry moved to the window, peering through the blinds at the street below. Everything looked normal. Evening commuters heading home, kids playing in a nearby park, the mundane rhythm of ordinary life. It was hard to believe that in this normal-looking world, powerful people were plotting their deaths. "Sophia," Henry said, turning back to her, "the recording device you used in the park. How did you get FBI equipment?" Sophia's expression darkened. "Because I stole it. Before they tried to silence me, I broke into my handler's office and took everything I could find. Recordings, files, evidence of their corruption." She moved to a hidden panel in the wall and pulled out several boxes of documents. "This is everything, Henry. 3 years' worth of evidence, showing how deep the corruption goes." Henry stared at the boxes, overwhelmed by the scope of what they were facing. "Why didn't you go to the media? Why didn't you expose all of this?" "I tried, but every reporter I approached either ignored me or ended up dead." Sophia's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Car accidents, suicides, random muggings. Amazing how dangerous it is to be a journalist investigating corruption in this city. Henry felt the walls closing in around them. If Sophia was right, if the corruption was this extensive, then they weren't just fighting for justice for Timothy. They were fighting for their lives against an enemy with unlimited resources and no conscience. "There's something else," Sophia said, her voice growing quiet. "Something I haven't told you yet." Henry's stomach clenched. After everything they'd been through, he wasn't sure he could handle another revelation. "The night Timothy died," Sophia continued, "he wasn't just walking home from school. He was coming to find me." "What?" "I'd missed our meeting that day. I was at the job interview, remember? Timothy always worried when I didn't show up, so he decided to come looking for me." Sophia's voice broke. "If I hadn't taken that interview, if I hadn't been so desperate to prove I could get my life together, Timothy would never have been on that street. He'd still be alive." Henry stared at her, seeing the crushing weight of guilt she'd been carrying. All this time, he'd thought Timothy's death was random, senseless. Then he'd learned it was the result of corruption and cover-ups. Now he was discovering it was also the result of a 7-year-old boy's love for a friend who needed help. "Sophia," Henry said gently, moving closer to her, "Timothy's death wasn't your fault. It was the fault of a drunk driver and his corrupt father. It was the fault of a system that values power over justice. But if you hadn't what? Tried to better your life? Tried to honor Timothy's belief in you?" Henry cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Timothy died doing exactly what I raised him to do, helping someone he cared about. That's not tragedy, Sophia. That's heroism." Sophia broke down completely then, sobbing against Henry's chest as months of guilt and grief poured out of her. Henry held her tightly, feeling his own tears fall into her hair. They were both broken people, both carrying impossible burdens, both fighting enemies who seemed insurmountable. But they were fighting together. Henry's phone buzzed with another text. "Asterisk, you have 12 hours to turn over all evidence and disappear forever. Fail to comply, and you'll join your son. Asterisk." Sophia read the message over his shoulder, her body going rigid with fear. "They're not going to stop," she whispered. "Even if we give them everything, they'll still kill us. We know too much." Henry stared at the threatening message, feeling something cold and determined settle in his chest. For 3 months, he'd been a victim of grief, of helplessness, of a system that had failed his son. But now, holding Sophia in his arms, surrounded by evidence of corruption that stretched back years, he realized something important. He was done being a victim. "Then we don't give them anything," Henry said, his voice steady and strong. "We take the fight to them instead." Sophia pulled back to look at him, hope and fear warring in her eyes. "Henry, they have the FBI, the DA's office, organized crime connections. What do we have?" Henry smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached his eyes. "We have the truth. We have evidence. And we have something they don't expect." "What's that?" "A billionaire with nothing left to lose, and a federal witness with everything to fight for." Henry's voice grew fierce with determination. "They think they're hunting us, Sophia. But tomorrow, we start hunting them." As they stood together in the safe house, surrounded by the evidence that could bring down their enemies, Henry felt something he hadn't experienced since Timothy's death. The absolute certainty that his son's death would not be in vain. But outside in the darkness, their enemies were already moving. and the deadliest phase of their war was about to begin. Neither Henry nor Sophia realized that their location had already been compromised, and that by morning, everything they thought they knew about their enemies, and each other, would be shattered forever. The explosion shattered the pre-dawn silence, throwing Henry from the couch where he'd been dozing. Glass rained down from the apartment windows as car alarms screamed in the distance. Sophia was already moving, grabbing the boxes of evidence with practiced efficiency. "Gas leak in the building next door," she said grimly, checking the security monitors. "What are the odds?" Henry peered through the smoke-hazed window and saw figures in tactical gear moving through the chaos below. "Not very good." "Back exit," Sophia said, slinging a laptop bag over her shoulder. "We have maybe 3 minutes before they breach the stairwell." They moved through the apartment like a well-rehearsed team, gathering only the most critical evidence. As they reached the reinforced back door, Henry grabbed Sophia's arm. "Wait," he said, his voice suddenly urgent. "You said you stole files from your FBI handler. What if some of those files contained information about other safe houses?" Sophia's face went pale. "You think they've been tracking us through my own evidence?" Before Henry could answer, the sound of boots thundering up the stairwell reached them. They were out of time. Sophia activated what looked like a fire alarm, but instead of a siren, Henry heard the subtle hiss of gas. "Knockout gas," she explained, pulling on a small respirator and handing him another. "Bought us 30 seconds, maybe less." They slipped out the back exit onto a fire escape as the first tactical officers reached their floor. Henry's business suit was hardly ideal for scaling metal ladders, but adrenaline propelled him downward with surprising speed. "This way," Sophia whispered, leading him through a maze of alleys and back streets that she seemed to know by heart. "There's somewhere we can go, but you're not going to like it." 20 minutes later, they stood before the imposing gates of Riverside Cemetery. Sophia was right. Henry didn't like it. The last place he wanted to be while running for his life was the site of his son's grave. "Trust me," Sophia said, producing a key from her jacket. "The groundskeeper is an old friend. He won't ask questions." They made their way through the misty cemetery to a small maintenance building hidden among the older headstones. Inside, Sophia's friend, a weathered man in his 60s, was waiting with coffee and grim news. "They've been here," he said without preamble. "FBI, local cops, even some men who didn't show badges. All looking for you too." "Did they find anything?" Sophia asked. The groundskeeper smiled slightly. "Hard to find what's not there to find. But they did leave something behind." He handed Sophia a manila envelope. "Agent Mills said to give you this when you showed up." Sophia opened the envelope with trembling hands, and Henry watched her face crumble as she read. Without a word, she handed him the document. It was a death certificate. Timothy James Lockett. But the date was wrong. It showed Timothy dying 2 weeks before the actual accident. "What is this?" Henry asked, his voice hoarse. "It's a message," Sophia whispered. "They're telling us they can rewrite history. They can make it look like Timothy died of natural causes, like the accident never happened. They can erase everything we've been fighting for." Henry stared at the forged document, feeling rage build in his chest like molten steel. "Over my dead body." "That's exactly what they're planning," the groundskeeper said quietly. "But there might be another way." Sophia looked up sharply. "What do you mean, Frank?" Frank gestured for them to follow him deeper into the maintenance building. Hidden behind false walls was a sophisticated communications setup. Computers, monitors, and equipment that looked far too advanced for a cemetery groundskeeper. 20 years ago, I was NSA, Frank explained, seeing their surprised expressions. When I retired, I kept some insurance policies, including access to certain databases that officially don't exist. He pulled up files on his computer, and Henry saw Michael Brennan's name at the top of a long list. Your DA friend has been busy. 3 cover-ups in the past 5 years, all involving his son. But that's not the interesting part. What's the interesting part? Henry asked. Frank's fingers flew over the keyboard, bringing up financial records. The interesting part is who's been paying for the cover-ups. Your boy James Brennan isn't just Daddy's problem child. He's an asset for a human trafficking operation run by the Kozlov crime family. Sophia's intake of breath was sharp and sudden. The Kozlovs? I testified against them 2 years ago. I thought they were all in prison. The small fish are, Frank said. But the big fish are still swimming, and they've been using James Brennan as their inside man. He doesn't just hit people with his car by accident. He targets specific individuals. People who might testify against the organization. People who know too much. Henry felt the world tilt around him. Are you saying Timothy's death wasn't random? Frank pulled up another file, and Henry's blood turned to ice. It was a surveillance photo of Timothy talking to Sophia in the park, dated the day before the accident. Your son was targeted, Frank said gently. Not because of who he was, but because of who he was talking to. Sophia's identity had been compromised. They knew she was a federal witness, and they knew she was getting close to someone new, who had the resources to cause them real problems. Sophia sank into a chair, her face ashen. They killed Timothy to send me a message, to warn me away from investigating his death. But it backfired, Henry said, understanding flooding through him. Instead of scaring you off, it gave you a reason to fight. Frank nodded. And that's when they realized they had a bigger problem. Because now you were both involved, and together you represented a threat they couldn't ignore. Henry looked at Sophia, seeing her in an entirely new light. She hadn't just been a random homeless person Timothy had befriended. She'd been a target, and his son had died protecting her from killers who were coming for her anyway. There's more, Frank said, his voice growing urgent. I intercepted communications from the Kozlov organization. They're planning something big, a final solution to their Sofia Rivera problem. Tonight. What kind of final solution? Sophia asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. They're going to stage a murder-suicide. Make it look like you killed Henry in a lover's quarrel. Then turn the gun on yourself. All the evidence of corruption dies with you, and the Kozlov's operation remains protected. Henry felt something cold and determined settle in his chest. For months, he'd been reacting to events, trying to understand what had happened to his son. But now he finally saw the complete picture. Timothy hadn't died in a random accident. He'd died as part of a deliberate plan to silence Sophia and protect a criminal organization. When? Henry asked, his voice deadly quiet. According to the intercepts, they're moving tonight. They have your location, all of your locations. Safe houses, backup plans, everything. Sophia looked up at Henry with desperate eyes. We can't keep running. They'll always find us. Then we stop running, Henry said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Frank, how secure is this location? Secure enough, but not indefinitely. Why? Henry moved to the communication equipment, an idea forming in his mind. Because we're going to do something they'll never expect. We're going to go public. All of it. Tonight. Sophia stood up, hope replacing despair in her expression. A live broadcast. Better than that, Henry said, his business instincts taking over. I'm going to call an emergency board meeting of Lockett Industries. Full media coverage, live streaming, all the major networks. Once we're in front of cameras, they can't touch us without exposing themselves. Frank was already working at his computers. I can hack into the city's emergency broadcast system, push your signal to every screen in New York. But you'll need to get to your corporate headquarters alive. Leave that to me, Sophia said, her voice strong and sure for the first time since Henry had met her. I know these streets better than they do. I know how to disappear and reappear where they least expect it. Henry looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the broken woman he'd met at Timothy's grave, but the federal witness who had survived 3 years underground, the journalist who had never stopped investigating, the fighter who had loved his son enough to risk everything for justice. Sophia, he said, taking her hands in his, when this is over, when we've brought down everyone responsible for Timothy's death. When this is over, she said, standing on her toes to kiss him gently, we'll talk about whether Timothy was right about us being a family. Henry kissed her back, tasting hope and determination, and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. Around them, Frank worked frantically to prepare their final gambit, while outside, their enemies closed in for what they thought would be the kill. But Henry Lockett hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by backing down from fights. And Sophia Rivera hadn't survived 3 years in witness protection by giving up when things got dangerous. Together, they were about to show their enemies what happened when you threaten the people they loved. In 6 hours, every screen in New York City would carry their story. But first, they had to survive the deadliest night of their lives. The Lockett Industries building rose into the Manhattan sky like a steel and glass monument to Henry's life's work. At 11 p.m., it should have been empty except for security guards. Instead, every major news network had crews positioned around the building, their satellite trucks creating a carnival of lights in the darkness. Henry and Sophia sat in Frank's unmarked van 3 blocks away, watching the feeds from multiple news stations on portable monitors. The story had already begun. Billionaire developer promises shocking revelations about son's death, scrolled across every major network. Security reports are clean, Frank said, monitoring police frequencies. But that doesn't mean anything. If they're smart, they'll wait until you're inside and then cut the power, blame it on technical difficulties. Sophia checked her equipment one final time. A small camera hidden in her jacket, backup recording devices, and the complete evidence files uploaded to secure servers around the world. If we don't make it out of this building alive, she said to Henry, everything gets released automatically at midnight. Henry squeezed her hand. We're going to make it out. Both of us. Mr. Lockett, Frank's voice was urgent. You need to see this. On the monitor, a breaking news alert flashed. District Attorney Michael Brennan announces major breakthrough in Timothy Lockett murder case. Henry's blood ran cold as Brennan appeared on screen, standing at a podium with James Brennan beside him. Not in handcuffs, but in an expensive suit, looking every inch the innocent victim. Ladies and gentlemen, Brennan said, his voice carrying the authority of his office, tonight we have identified the real killer of Timothy Lockett. Sophia Rivera, a mentally unstable individual with a history of violence, has been stalking both the Lockett family and my own family for months. Sophia gasped as her photograph, clearly taken from her FBI file, appeared on screen. Ms. Rivera is armed and extremely dangerous, Brennan continued. She has kidnapped Henry Lockett and is believed to be holding him hostage in the Lockett Industries building. We have reason to believe she intends to harm Mr. Lockett tonight. They're getting ahead of the story, Frank said grimly, making you the villain before you can speak. Henry felt rage burning in his chest, but also a cold calculation. No, he said slowly. They just made a fatal mistake. Sophia looked at him questioningly. They put James Brennan on television, Henry explained, standing next to his father, looking innocent and wronged, which means he's not in hiding anymore. He's presenting himself as a victim. Sophia's eyes widened with understanding. The facial recognition software. Frank was already typing furiously. Give me 30 seconds. Got it. James Brennan, spotted by traffic cameras 12 minutes ago, entering the Lockett building through the service entrance. Henry's smile was predatory. He's not there to rescue me. He's there to kill me. On live television, while his father provides him with the perfect alibi. We need to get you out of there, Sophia said urgently. No, Henry said, his voice steady and determined. We need to get in there. Because James Brennan just walked into the one place in the city where I have complete control. 20 minutes later, Henry and Sophia moved through the sub-basement levels of his own building, using maintenance tunnels that didn't appear on any public blueprints. Henry had designed these passages himself, back when he was paranoid about corporate espionage. Now they were saving his life. The boardroom is on the 42nd floor, Henry whispered as they reached a service elevator. All the media feeds terminate there. If we can get to the emergency broadcast controls. Henry, Sophia interrupted, grabbing his arm. Look. Through a small window in the elevator shaft, they could see figures in tactical gear moving through the lobby. Not police, private security with military-grade equipment. Kozlov's people, Sophia breathed. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. Henry's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Asterisk 42nd floor. Come alone, or Sophia dies slowly. Asterisk. Attached was a photograph that made Henry's vision go red with rage. Sophia was in the image, but it wasn't the Sophia beside him. It was an older photo, one that showed her bound and bloodied. A photo from her husband's murder 3 years ago. They were there, Sophia whispered, staring at the image. When David was killed, they took pictures. Henry understood immediately. The Kozlov organization hadn't just killed Sophia's husband. They'd documented it. Kept it as leverage, as a threat, as a reminder of what happened to people who crossed them. New plan, Henry said, his voice deadly calm. Frank, can you patch us into the building's internal security system? Frank's voice crackled through their earpieces. Already done. You have full access to cameras, locks, environmental controls, everything. Henry smiled grimly. Good. Because we're about to show James Brennan and his friends what happens when you come into my house uninvited. The elevator rose silently through the building as Henry accessed his security system through his phone. Floor by floor, he tracked the locations of their enemies. James Brennan was indeed on the 42nd floor, along with 4 armed men. 3 more teams were stationed throughout the building. Henry, Sophia said as they passed the 20th floor, there's something I need to tell you. About the night David died. Henry looked at her, seeing something new in her expression. Not fear, but a cold determination that matched his own. I didn't just witness his murder, Sophia continued. I recorded it. All of it. The corruption, the cover-up, the involvement of the Kozlov organization. I've been carrying the evidence for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to use it. Why now? Henry asked. Sophia's smile was fierce and beautiful. Because now I have something worth fighting for again. The elevator reached the 42nd floor, and Henry felt a strange calm descend over him. For 3 months, he'd been a victim of circumstances beyond his control. But this was his building, his boardroom, his rules. The doors opened to reveal James Brennan, standing at the head of the conference table, a gun in his hand and a smile on his face. He was younger than Henry had expected, maybe 25, with the entitled arrogance that came from a lifetime of having Daddy fix his problems. "Mr. Lockett," James said mockingly, "so good of you to join us. And you brought the crazy homeless lady. How touching." Henry stepped out of the elevator, his hands visible and empty. "James, I have to say, I'm disappointed. After all the trouble your father went to covering up your crimes, this is how you repay him? By walking into a building surrounded by news cameras?" James's smile faltered slightly. "The cameras aren't going to be a problem much longer." "Actually," Henry said, pressing a button on his phone, "they are." Every screen in the boardroom lit up simultaneously, not with news feeds, but with security camera footage from inside the building. Footage of James Brennan holding a gun. Footage of armed men in tactical gear. Footage that was being broadcast live to every news station in the city. "Surprise," Henry said. "You're on television." James's face went white as he realized the trap he'd walked into. "Turn it off." "Can't do that," Henry replied calmly. "The system is hardwired. Every major network in the country is carrying this feed live. Say hello to America, James." Sophia stepped forward, and Henry saw that she was no longer the broken woman from the cemetery. She was a federal witness, a trained journalist, and a woman with nothing left to lose. "James Brennan," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the cameras, "you killed Timothy Lockett on October 15th at 3:47 p.m. on 5th Avenue. You were driving your father's Mercedes, license plate JMB 2847. You were under the influence of cocaine and alcohol." "That's a lie." James screamed, but his gun was shaking in his hand. "You've killed before," Sophia continued relentlessly. "Marcus Williams, a homeless veteran, on March 3rd, 2023. Isabella Santos, an undocumented immigrant, on July 15th, 2024. All hit and runs. All covered up by your father." Henry watched James's face crumble as Sophia methodically destroyed his denials with specific dates, times, and evidence. Every word was being broadcast live to millions of viewers. "And tonight," Sophia said, "you came here to kill Henry Lockett and stage my suicide. Just like you killed my husband 3 years ago when he got too close to the truth about police corruption." James raised his gun towards Sophia, but Henry was already moving. 3 months of grief and rage and helplessness exploded into action as he tackled James to the ground. The gun skittered across the polished conference table as they fought. Sophia was at the computers now, uploading files that Frank had prepared. Financial records, police reports, photographs, recordings. 3 years of evidence about corruption that reached into every level of city government. "This is for Timothy," Henry said, pinning James to the ground. "And for Sophia's husband. And for every victim your family destroyed." James tried to reach for his gun, but Sophia was there first. She held the weapon steady, pointing it not at James, but at the camera. "My name is Sophia Rivera," she said, her voice strong and clear. "I'm a federal witness, and I'm about to tell you everything." For the next 10 minutes, as sirens wailed in the distance and James Brennan sobbed on the floor, Sophia methodically detailed the corruption network that had protected Timothy's killer. She named names, showed documents, and provided evidence that would topple administrations and destroy criminal organizations. Henry stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, watching as justice finally came for his son. When the FBI agents burst through the doors, real agents this time, not the corrupt ones who had tried to silence them, James Brennan was still on the ground, defeated and exposed. DA Michael Brennan's career was over, broadcast live to the nation. The Kozlov organization's protection network was shattered, and Timothy Lockett's death was finally, truly avenged. "Is it over?" Sophia asked as they watched James being led away in handcuffs. Henry pulled her close, feeling something he hadn't experienced in 3 months: peace. "It's over," he said. "Timothy can rest now." But as they stood together in the boardroom, where they'd won their impossible victory, both Henry and Sophia knew that their real journey was just beginning. 6 months later, the spring morning was warm and bright as Henry knelt beside Timothy's grave, placing fresh flowers on the small headstone. The marble had been cleaned recently, and new plantings surrounded the site, roses and daisies that would bloom throughout the summer, creating a garden of memory for his son. "The trial ended yesterday, buddy," Henry said softly, his fingers tracing Timothy's name carved in stone. "James Brennan got 25 to life. His father got 15 years for corruption and obstruction of justice. And 12 other people connected to the Kozlov organization are going away for a very long time." A gentle breeze rustled through the cemetery trees, carrying the scent of blooming flowers and the promise of new life. Henry had never believed in signs before, but something about that soft wind felt like approval, like peace. "Mr. Lockhart?" Henry turned to see a young woman approaching, one of the kids from Sophia's community center. Maria, he remembered, 17 years old, aging out of foster care, one of dozens of young people who had found hope and direction through Sophia's work. "She sent me to find you," Maria said with a shy smile. "She said to tell you that everything's ready." Henry stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "How does she look?" Maria's smile widened. "Like the most beautiful woman in the world." Henry laughed, feeling joy bubble up in his chest, a sensation that had become more frequent over the past few months as he'd learned to live with happiness alongside his grief. "Tell her I'll be there in 5 minutes." As Maria walked away, Henry turned back to Timothy's grave one final time. "I wish you could be there, son. I think you would have loved this day." He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Sophia says you already knew, though. She says you drew us together in that picture because you could see what we couldn't, that we belonged together." The wind stirred again, and Henry could swear he heard the echo of a 7-year-old's laughter carried on the breeze. 20 minutes later, Henry stood in the gardens behind the new Timothy Lockett Community Center, watching in amazement as nearly 200 people filled the space. There were reporters and city officials, business associates and community leaders, but most importantly, there were the people Timothy and Sophia had touched. Homeless individuals who had found housing, foster kids who had found direction, families who had found hope. Frank, the former NSA groundskeeper who had become an unlikely ally, a approached wearing an actual suit instead of his usual work clothes. "You clean up nice," Henry said with a grin. "Don't get used to it," Frank replied, but he was smiling. "This is a one-time thing. How are you holding up?" Henry looked around at the assembled crowd, at the community center that bore his son's name, at the life he was about to begin with the woman who had helped him find justice and peace. "I'm good, Frank. Really good." The music started. Not a traditional wedding march, but a soft acoustic guitar playing one of Timothy's favorite songs. Henry had worried that having a wedding so close to his son's grave would feel wrong. But Sophia had insisted this was exactly where they needed to start their new life together. Where it all began, where Timothy's love had brought them together. And then Sophia appeared, and Henry forgot how to breathe. She wore a simple white dress that she'd chosen herself, her dark hair crowned with small white flowers. But it wasn't her appearance that stopped his heart. It was the radiant joy on her face, the peace in her eyes, the way she looked at him like he was her whole world. As she walked toward him, Henry remembered the broken woman he'd first met at Timothy's grave 6 months ago. That woman had been consumed by guilt and grief, barely surviving from day to day. The woman walking toward him now was strong, confident, and whole. She'd taken her pain and transformed it into purpose, building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. "Hi," she said softly when she reached him, her voice carrying just a hint of nervousness. "Hi yourself," Henry replied, taking her hands in his. "You look incredible." "You don't look so bad yourself," Sophia said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Think Timothy would approve?" Henry glanced toward the cemetery visible through the garden trees, then back at Sophia's face. "I think Timothy orchestrated this whole thing." The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, officiated by Father Martinez from Sophia's childhood church. They'd written their own vows, and when it came time for Sophia to speak, her voice was clear and strong. "Henry," she said, "6 months ago, we were both broken people carrying unbearable grief. We thought our stories were ending, that the best parts of our lives were behind us. But Timothy taught us something important. That love doesn't end with death, it transforms. It becomes something new, something that can heal and inspire and create hope where there was none." Henry felt tears on his cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "You've given me a family I never thought I'd have," Sophia continued. "You've given me a purpose beyond survival, a future beyond just getting through each day. And most importantly, you've shown me that Timothy's love didn't die with him. It lives on in every life we touch, every person we help, every moment of happiness we create together." When it was Henry's turn, he looked out at the crowd of faces, people whose lives had been changed by the community center, by Sophia's work, by the justice they'd fought for together. "Sophia," he said, "you gave me back my son. Not the physical presence I lost, but the essence of who Timothy was, his compassion, his belief in people, his determination to help others no matter the cost. Through you, I learned that Timothy's death wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of something larger." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "You showed me that love isn't diminished by loss, it's multiplied. That grief shared becomes bearable, and hope shared becomes unstoppable. And that sometimes the person who needs saving the most is the one doing the saving." After they exchanged rings, simple gold bands engraved with Timothy's favorite phrase, "Be brave," Father Martinez pronounced them husband and wife. As they kissed, the crowd erupted in cheers, and Henry felt something settle in his chest that had been missing since Elena's death 7 years ago. He felt complete. The reception was held in the community center itself, surrounded by Timothy's artwork and photos of the young people Sophia had helped. Henry found himself in conversation after conversation with kids who had aged out of foster care, homeless individuals who had found housing, families who had been reunited through Sophia's advocacy work. "She saved my life," a young man named Marcus told Henry. "I was about to give up completely when I met her. She helped me get into college, find housing, believe in myself again. She said a little boy taught her that everyone deserves to be saved." Similar stories came from dozens of people throughout the evening. Sophia had taken Timothy's lesson, his belief that every person mattered, that everyone deserved help, and built it into a mission that had transformed countless lives. As the evening wound down, Henry and Sophia found themselves alone on the center's rooftop garden, looking out over the city lights. Sophia was curled against his side, her head on his shoulder, still wearing her wedding dress. "Do you think he knows?" Sophia asked softly. "Do you think Timothy knows what happened tonight?" Henry looked up at the stars scattered across the clear spring sky. "I think Timothy knew 6 months ago when he drew that picture of our family. I think he's been watching over us this whole time, making sure we found our way to each other." Sophia was quiet for a long moment. "I miss him," she said finally. "Is that strange? Missing someone I only knew for 2 weeks." "Not strange at all," Henry replied. "Timothy had that effect on people. He made you feel like you'd known him forever, like you were important to him from the moment you met." He tightened his arms around his wife. "He loved you, Sophia. In his innocent, pure way, he loved you completely. And through you, he's still changing lives." Sophia lifted her head to look at him. "What happens now? I mean, we got justice for Timothy, we stopped the corruption, we built something meaningful from the tragedy. What comes next?" Henry smiled, thinking about the plans they'd made, the dreams they'd shared over the past few months. "Now we live. We run the community center together. We help kids who need advocates. We make sure Timothy's memory keeps changing lives." He paused, his voice growing tender. "And maybe, if we're very lucky, we add to our family." Sophia's eyes widened. "Henry, I know it's soon," Henry said quickly. "I know we have time to think about it. But I can't help imagining what it would be like to have children who grow up knowing about their big brother Timothy, who understand that love is about helping others, that being brave means standing up for people who need protection." Sophia's smile was radiant. Timothy would be the best big brother in the world. "He already is," Henry said, pulling her close for another kiss. "He brought us together, didn't he?" As they sat together under the stars, Henry felt Timothy's presence around them, not as grief or loss, but as love and hope and the promise of a future built on the foundation of a 7-year-old's compassion. His son's death had been a tragedy, but it had also been a catalyst for something beautiful. 3 blocks away, fresh flowers bloomed on a small grave, tended by a groundskeeper who had become family, visited regularly by dozens of young people whose lives had been changed by a story of love and justice and redemption. And somewhere in the spring breeze that rustled through the cemetery trees, a little boy's laughter echoed with joy, knowing that his daddy and his friend Sophia had found their way home to each other at last. 6 months ago, Henry Lockhart had been a broken billionaire kneeling beside his son's grave, consumed by grief and rage. Tonight, he was a husband, a community leader, and a man who understood that the greatest buildings aren't made of steel and glass. They're made of hope, love, and the unshakable belief that every person deserves to be saved. Timothy's death had taken one beautiful life from the world. But Timothy's love, expressed through Sophia's work, Henry's resources, and their shared commitment to justice, had saved hundreds more. And that, Henry thought as he held his wife under the stars, was exactly the kind of legacy his brave, compassionate son would have wanted. What an incredible journey we've been on together. From that first heartbreaking meeting at Timothy's grave to this beautiful ending where love truly conquers all. This story shows us that even in our darkest moments, there's always hope for redemption, justice, and new beginnings. What part of Henry and Sophia's story resonated most with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like this remind us all why love, courage, and fighting for what's right will always triumph in the end. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It is as interesting and even more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.